But yeah, all right, let's get started. Did everybody have a good lunch? Feeling full? Feeling awake? Ready for a nice long conversation about policy? All right. All right. So at the beginning of my last presentation, I told you I'm a motivational speaker, and I'm going to show you that you have the power. And this is the power I'm talking about. You have the power under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act to certify all federal permits. And I'm talking to the state people. Federal people, you don't have any power, I'm sorry. All right, so here's your disclaimer. So, if there's one thing that you get from this presentation, I want it to be that Section 401 of the Clean Water Act gives the direct authority to states to certify federal permits. It's not a delegated authority. It's not something that EPA can take away. EPA can't write a 401 certification on behalf of a state. It's the power that belongs to the states. All right, so what does Section 401 of the Clean Water Act say? It says, no federal permit or license can be issued that may result in a discharge to waters of the United States. We know what all those words mean because we've talked about them before, unless the state or authorized tribe certifies that the discharge is consistent with standards and other water quality goals, or if they waive their authority to do so. So, no 401 certification or waiver means no permit. All right. So who has 401 certification authority? The states do. All states. All states where the discharge originates, so it has to be the state where the discharge is, has 401 certification authority. And again, this is a direct authority granted from the Clean Water Act, not from EPA. EPA writes some guidance around 401 certifications, but the authority sits with the states. So Indian tribes can also be authorized to write 401 certifications. And this typically happens when they apply for treatment in a manner similar to a state, or treatment as a state, TAS, to write their own water quality standards. Typically, they apply for 401 certification authority as well, but they don't have to. They can apply for 401 certification authority without water quality standards, or they can develop water quality standards without 401 certification authority. Yeah, so that covers all of it. So for tribes that have not received treatment as a state for the 401 program, the EPA regional office, and for EPA Region 9, that's people like me, writes certifications on behalf of the tribes. So what actions trigger 401 certifications? Federal permits. So that includes permits under the Clean Water Act, like 402 and 404. So 404 permits are mostly issued by the Corps of Engineers, but states can assume the federal 404 program. If a state assumes the 404 program and writes their own 404 permit, they no longer have to write 401 certifications. It's assumed that they're only issuing permits for activities that comply with water quality standards. The same applies for 402. So if a state has a delegated 402 program, they don't need to write 401 certifications for their own permits. These are only certifications of federal permits. Now, 401 certifications aren't limited to permits under the Clean Water Act. They also apply to permits under the Rivers and Harbors Act, which is also administered by the Corps of Engineers. So 401 certifications are also required for any Rivers and Harbors Act permit that results in a discharge to waters of the United States. It also applies to FERC relicenses. So anytime that someone applies for a license or relicensing from FERC, that also triggers 401. I'm not sure about the Atomic Energy Act. I haven't seen that used before. Does anybody have an experience with that? All right.
Can you give an example of a 401 certification which is not a 404, initiated by 404 permit, initiated by Rivers and Harbors Act? I don't know what that act does.
Okay. Yeah, so the Rivers and Harbors Act is a really old statute, basically that gave the Corps of Engineers authority over navigation in navigable waters. So unlike the Clean Water Act, it only applies to those traditionally navigable waters. And under the Rivers and Harbors Act, you need a permit if you want to place a structure in a traditionally navigable water, like a dock or any sort of dredging can require Rivers and Harbors Act certification. Or also, you need authorization from the Corps of Engineers to do activities on levees. That's also under the Rivers and Harbors Act. So all of those things require 401 certification if there's a discharge involved. Rivers and Harbors Act also includes statutes beyond the regulatory program, so not everything under the Rivers and Harbors Act requires a certification. All right. Yes?
Does that mean that Army Corps cannot issue their 404 permit until after we have done the 401 certification?
No. So the Corps can issue a conditional 404 permit saying you can't actually do this work until you receive 401 certification.
Okay, so say they don't receive a 401, they don't receive that conditional, and then they go ahead and dredge. That means they're in violation of 401 and 404.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and that does get a little bit into the legal side. There's a lot of kind of controversy and questions around who is responsible for enforcing conditions under 401, and I don't really have any great answers on that. But yeah, so in the case that you described, that would be a violation of the Clean Water Act under 404 and 401.
I guess I'll say Army Corps doesn't permit itself, so it doesn't issue its own 404s, but we still have to write a 401. And can issue WDRs along with that.
Yeah, so like Corps Civil Works projects can require 401.
Well, most are federal navigational dredging.
All right. Any other questions about what actions trigger 401 certification? All right. Yes?
If there's a permit issued that could result in a discharge, and the federal agency isn't sure whether they require a 401, do they go to EPA?
Yeah, so EPA is who writes the guidance and regulations around 401, even though states administer the program. Yeah, so EPA would be the one to answer that question. All right, we'll move on. So this is the basic process under 401. And like I said, when they apply for the 401 certification versus when they apply for the federal permit, there's no set process for when that has to happen. So they can apply for the permit first before going for the cert, or they can apply for the cert first before going for the permit. And in states like California, which have their own independent regulatory programs like Port Cologne, sometimes it makes more sense to go to the state first. So yeah, the applicant will go to the state or authorized tribe for certification. The state or tribe will review it. A public notice is required to issue an individual 401 certification. States and tribes can also programmatically certify those general permits I was talking about in the last presentation. And all they have to do then is certify a general permit once, put whatever conditions they want on it, and then those will apply programmatically for the life of that general permit. Does that make sense to everyone? So yeah, so like I said, a lot of 95% of 404 authorizations happen under general permits. So if a state chooses not to certify one of those general permits that's used a lot, that can create a lot of additional workload for the state. So that's something to consider, when you're deciding whether or not to certify a general permit. You can also always conditionally certify a general permit, or you can only certify certain conditions under a general permit, or certain activities under a general permit, and say that all others require individual certification. So there's a lot of flexibility provided for states under 401 because it's a direct authority.
How often 401 certification should be renewed?
Oh yeah, I can say. So the question was, how often do 401 certifications need to be renewed? So certifications go with the permit. So it'll last for the lifetime of a permit. So 5 years in most cases with a 404 permit. Yeah.
And just for my clarification, that it's for one certification is just one for one permit, or for the same type of the permits conducted by, for example?
Yeah, so you can programmatically certify a general permit, so certify all activities that would fall under that general permit, but you can't programmatically certify like a class of individual permits. You can't say all individual permits covering impacts to up to X acres of wetlands are programmatically certified by the state. The state still has to issue for individual certifications for each one, or waive.
Do you happen to recall the public notice information, the guidelines offhand?
I do not.
No worries.
But yeah, I do know that public notices are required for individual certifications. Oh. All right. So when a certification has been applied for, they'll provide a copy of that certification to the permitting agency, like the Corps of Engineers or FERC, or EPA if it's an EPA issued 402 permit, and then they will notify EPA of that certification. So typically, we actually just receive copies of certification notices directly from the state, but EPA has a role in reviewing 401s to determine if water quality can be affected across state lines, and that's EPA's role. All right. So when you're evaluating a 401 certification request, states and tribes should consider all potential water quality impacts, both direct and indirect, for the life of the project. That's not the duration of the permit, it's the life of the project. So that could be, typically dams are expected to last like 75 to 100 years, but it could be much longer. And when we're talking about dredge and fill, we're talking about generally long-term impacts. So the information that states or tribes can use to evaluate 401 certification requests can be based on data provided in the federal permit application, but they can also request additional information either programmatically through application procedures or just on a case-by-case basis as they review. So a lot of flexibility. All right, so before issuing a certification, these are some things that need to be determined. Is the activity going to be consistent with effluent limitations, water quality standards, new source performance standards, toxic pollutant limitations, and then any other appropriate state or tribal requirements. And that last one is important because that means that non-Clean Water Act programs can be the basis for granting, denying, or waiving, or granting with conditions 401 certifications. So in California, one that's come up recently is the State Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So the state can deny, even though it's not a federal program, the state can deny 401 certification on the basis of that state law. All right, any questions about that? All right, so now we're gonna go into the options for what a state or tribe can do after receiving a 401 certification request. So the first option is just to grant 401 certification outright with no conditions, indicating that the activity requested in the federal permit is fully consistent with state water quality standards and all those other water quality related provisions. And this means that that federal agency can just move forward without further consultation with the state on 401 and either issue or deny that permit or license. A similar thing that they can do is grant but add conditions to the 401 certification. So that says that the activity in the federal permit is consistent with 401 or with state water quality standards, but only if the conditions in the 401 certification are met. And the scope of those conditions can be really broad. They tend to be pretty targeted on the water quality impacts of construction when we talk about 401 permits. So they typically include a lot of required best management practices for construction, but they can also include things that might not necessarily agree with what's in the Corps' 404 permit. So they could require additional compensatory mitigation. They could require different compensatory mitigation, essentially, which can have the effect of making applicants compensate twice for the same action. They can require additional minimization measures, or they can say, we're not certifying the entire project. You can't build this part. All right. So, and then every condition that goes into that 401 certification becomes a term of the permit. So the federal agency can't choose to selectively enforce conditions in a 401 permit based on what they'd prefer to do. And then if the applicant disagrees with the conditions that are put in the 401 certification, the only way to deal with that is through the appropriate form of state law. They can't just go to the federal permitting agency and say, we don't like this, please take this out of our permit.
What about for tribes? If they don't, they would have to go to the tribal court?
Yeah, I think that would be the implication. I'm less familiar with how disputes under 401 work with an authorized tribal program compared to a state. Since the statute refers to states, there might be some exceptions for tribes. Yes?
What if the applicant is actually a federal agency, like the Army Corps or the Navy? They are their own applicant.
Yeah.
So can we deny their project even though?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I was talking about that example of the State Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. The applicant in this case is a federal agency. Even if they are a federal agency and have 401 certification denied, as long as there's a federal permit required, they are held to the requirements of Section 401. Yeah. All right, I'll move on to the third option. So a state or authorized tribe can also choose to deny 401 certification, and that implies that the activity, no matter how they could potentially condition it, would not be consistent with state water quality standards or other applicable provisions. And the effect is the permit is denied. A federal agency can issue a permit that would have a discharge to waters of the United States if 401 certification is denied. All right, any questions about denial? Yes?
The slide says that the implication of denial is that no conditions, there's
Right.
nothing you could do to condition it to meet the standards. Where are you getting that implication? Do you know?
If there were conditions that could be granted that would allow a project to be consistent with water quality standards and other relevant aspects of state water quality laws and regulations, then presumably the state would issue the certification with those conditions, right?
I'm just curious why the assumption is that if the application indicates that it does not, as proposed, meet water quality standards, why there's an implication that the state would develop those conditions if any conditions out there are possible, as opposed to simply denying and putting that burden on the applicant.
I think I'm having a little trouble understanding the question. So if a project could conceivably meet water quality standards if certain conditions were put on it, the state wouldn't really have basis to deny 401 certification, right? Because 401 certification is supposed to be about water quality. Yeah.
So just taking the example you said where the state has the authority to approve half a project and not the other half, right? So half the project does not have, cannot comply with water quality standards, and maybe the other half of the project can. I'm not sure where this implication that the state has to develop conditions to go up to that edge comes from, and I'm curious if you do.
Well, so when I use that example of only certifying part of a project, that's assuming that the applicant still views that project as viable, right? So, so if the applicant and the state can't come to some agreement about, what conditions the applicant would be willing to be willing to take on a permit, or would be able to take on a permit, and which what the state can't allow, then the state should just deny the application, right?
I'm curious if there's somewhere in the case law or in regs or in something that, because this is different than the way I would interpret the statute, but I've heard this several times from just sort of in different fora and in EPA, and I'm wondering, do you know of anything where this is coming from? Because I haven't been able to find that, because that's an additional obligation on the states, right? It's like, here's this application, you can approve, deny, or also what you have to do is come up with every condition that could make this work, right? Or that you have to work with the applicant to see what they still would like and whether that could work. None of that's in the statute. And so I'm just wondering where that's coming from.
I think probably this needs more discussion, but I would say it's coming from the text of the Clean Water Act that says that 401 water quality certifications are for states to certify that a federal permit would not violate water quality standards or other applicable water quality laws. So if there's some reason that the state is conditioning or denying a permit that isn't based on water quality, that would not be consistent with.
It's not about water quality. It's it can be very difficult to develop a condition that will allow compliance if you have a proposed operation that's going to cause problems. And so it's a question of where does the idea of this obligation come up?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know if I can provide any more clarity than that.
Yeah, we need to, I'm afraid, table that topic for discussion with EPA lawyers or otherwise and move the training forward.
But yeah, we can talk more about this afterwards. All right, and then there is a fourth option. So a state can choose to waive their 401 water quality certification, and it can be an implicit waiver. So if a state chooses not to act on 401 certification requests after a year is typically what's used, and that's the amount of time that appears in the statute. the permitting agency can assume that that certifying authority has been waived, or a state can just state outright, we're going to choose to waive our certification authority here. And the effect of waiving is not so different from the effect of granting without conditions. It's just saying that we're choosing not, instead of saying this activity is consistent with water quality standards, it's just saying we're not choosing to act on this application. And there's some questions out there as to whether waiving 401 is allowable under the text of the Clean Water Act. But that is probably another question for our lawyers. All right, so those are your 4 options. So what about neighboring jurisdictions? As I alluded to before, EPA plays a role in ensuring that water quality certifications originating in one state that might have some effect on another state are talked about. So EPA receives a notice of a 401 certification. Says from the Federal Permitting Licensing Agency, but I think I often receive it directly from the state. If EPA determines that there may be an effect on a neighboring state or tribe, EPA would then notify that potentially affected state or tribe. Then the state or tribe can submit objections. They can also request a public hearing. And then during that hearing, EPA would submit its evaluation of the 401 certification from the issuing state and any recommendations. So if EPA submits an evaluation or recommendations on a 401, the federal licensing agency or permitting agency needs to address those issues in the final permit. Doesn't need to do exactly what's requested by those neighboring jurisdictions, though. And this is different from the conditions that go into a 401 certification. These would be conditions on the federal permit or license itself. Does anybody have questions about that? It's not something that I've actually done before because California is such a big state and we don't. All right. So more or less 4 players here, minimum. You've got the project proponent or permit applicant. You've got the federal permitting or licensing agency, the agency with the 401 certification authority, whether that's a state or an authorized tribe, or EPA's regional office if it's in an area where states lack authority, typically in a tribe that has not been authorized to issue 401 certifications, and then any neighboring states or tribes that might be affected by the discharge. All right. So EPA's looking at doing some 401 certification related rulemaking right now. We've heard from stakeholders a number of concerns about how long it takes to get 401 certifications, appropriate scope of issues, whether those are being limited to water quality or not, whether the necessary information to evaluate 401 certifications is being provided in applications or repeatedly asked for by certifying agencies. And then, as I mentioned before, who is actually responsible for enforcing 401 certification conditions? There was an executive order about this, I think 2 months ago, and EPA is currently pursuing some rulemaking related to 401 certifications. EPA headquarters issued some new guidance on 401 just last week, so it didn't actually make it into this presentation. I'm happy to send you guys a link to it or something, though. All right, so here's an example of a 401 certification and what conditions you might want to consider including in a 401 cert. So an applicant comes in and applies for a 404 permit to develop a subdivision, and they want it to be like a golf course community. So they want to also develop a golf course there. What kind of conditions do you want to have on that 404 permit? Anything related to stormwater runoff, either during construction or post-construction. Anything that they're going to be doing on the golf course, if they're going to be stocking fish, that's something you could also include in a 401 certification. Any sort of buffers that you want to include around development to protect water quality. Any sort of biological controls of weeds or pests. And then any other BMPs related to construction or operations.
So does that certification apply to the entire project or just the areas where dredge and fill is going to occur?
It would apply to the entire project as far as so when the Corps evaluates a 404 permit, they look at the overall project purpose, and that tends to be focused on what requires the discharge of dredge or fill material, but it does include the overall purpose of the project. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. Any other questions? Yes?
Could you talk about what the anti-degradation analysis would look like in a 401 cert? And I'm thinking of maybe a project that proposes to fill a wetland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the states that is incorporated wetlands pretty well into their anti-deg policy is Ohio, and they actually designate tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 wetlands. Actually, I don't know if they designate tier 1 wetlands. I think they just assume that everything that isn't, or everything's tier 1, right? There, I think, having reviewed this and still actually kind of learning how anti-deg works, the way that they apply that to evaluating 401 certifications is generally focused on compensatory mitigation requirements. Impacts to higher tier wetlands require higher mitigation ratios. So that's one example. I'm sure there are other conditions that apply there. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I find intellectually difficult is if we talked earlier about tier 1, if it's an existing use, you can't impair the water body below that under the anti-degradation. So when you're filling a wetland, you're destroying that wetland. So is it enough to just say, well, we couldn't avoid, we couldn't minimize, and now we're going to require you to mitigate those impacts?
Yeah, I think in the example that we used with our little Mad Libs, the tier 1 policy referred to a class of wetlands, and I think that's how you get around it, right? So we're going to be impacting some of this class of wetlands, and the water body here would be all of the wetlands of this type in this region, and to offset those and to maintain the use, we're going to require some mitigation to increase the amount of or to maintain the level of area and functions and values for the overall class of wetlands. So we're less focused on the individual water body and more focused on the type. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Yeah, so here's another example. This would be a new hydropower dam, which would presumably require both a 404 permit and a license from FERC. In this case, the certifying agency chose to deny 401 certification because of the destruction of wetland habitat, impacts to threatened or endangered species, a range of water quality standards violations that were expected to occur if the dam was licensed and built. Because of some errors that the applicant made when they submitted their 401 application, willingly or unwillingly. So in review, the Section 401 of the Clean Water Act says no federal permit or license can be issued that may result in a discharge to waters of the United States unless the state or authorized tribe certifies that the discharge is consistent with standards and other water quality goals or waives 401. And again, no 401 cert or waiver, no federal permit or license. All right. And yeah, you can find a copy of the draft 401 certification handbook online. And now let's go through a couple of knowledge check questions. All right, true or false? EPA is the certifying agency for all federal licenses or permits under Section 401. False. All right, when does EPA issue 401 certifications? All right. Yeah, so we issue 401 certifications where the states lack authority, and that is the vast majority of the time that is on tribal trust land for tribes that have not been authorized to issue 401 certifications. All right, next question. So a tribe that has assumed responsibility to administer the Water Quality Standards Program must make a separate application to EPA for approval to issue 401 certifications. Yep, that is also false. So they can submit separate applications if they want, or they can submit them together. It doesn't matter. It's just whatever the tribe prefers. All right, true or false? 401 certifications are necessary only for activities licensed or permitted under the Clean Water Act. All right, yeah, we went over that a lot. Any federal license or permit that may result in a discharge to waters of the U.S. All right, got a multiple choice question now. So in reviewing an application for a federal license or permit, the certifying agency may consider which of the following factors: only short-term direct water quality impacts, only long-term direct water quality impacts, both short-term and long-term not to exceed 5 years direct and indirect impacts, or D, direct and indirect short and long-term impacts over the life of the project. Yeah, that's good. D, all the impacts for the life of the project. All right, so which of the following are a possible outcome of 401 certification application review? What are the options for the certifying agency? All right. So there are 4 of them, right? Yeah, grant, condition, deny, or waive. Yeah, and then B, C, and D are all terms used in connection with water quality standards. And then, yeah, there are 2 ways to waive. There's the implicit waiver and the explicit waiver. All right, so if a project is located in jurisdiction A, but there are water quality impacts in jurisdiction B is powerless to affect jurisdiction A's decision. False. All right, yeah. Jurisdiction B can submit objections and or request a public hearing. True or false? Since 401 certifications apply to federal licenses or permits, the state or tribe may not consider any requirements of tribal or state laws that are more stringent than federal implementing regulations. It's false, yeah. So they can consider more stringent conditions, and they consider non-Clean Water Act programs as long as they're linked to water quality. All right, so which of the following is correct? In a 401 certification review, EPA may A, request a public hearing, B, submit its evaluation and recommendations, C, override the certifying agency's decisions if it was arbitrary and capricious, because those are decisions that EPA makes, or D, notify other jurisdictions if a project will have impacts in multiple jurisdictions. Yeah, it's D, and we also can submit an evaluation of the 401 certification. All right, true or false? It is possible for a tribe or state to lose the right to condition or deny certification for a permit or license application simply by taking too long for the review. It is true, yeah. So you have 1 year from receipt of a complete application to, yeah, Gary?
Yeah, you're talking about 404 permits, but in 401,
Right.
402 permits, the waiver time period is much shorter. It's 60 days.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So, yeah, so the 1 year provision that just applies to 404 permits. So, yeah, and that goes to show how important it is to be familiar with the timeframes associated with different types of federal permits too, especially things like FERC licenses and relicensings. All right, this one's from Donna. Anyone answering all these questions correctly automatically receives a $1,000 check from EPA. All right, yeah, talk to the water quality assessment team. All right. So I think we're ready to move on to the exercise.